Okay, welcome to the stream. Today, as per the title, we are watching philosophy lectures where we watched one lecture, which was an introduction to philosophy, and we are 30 minutes into this other 2 hour lecture where they are talking about Plato, and so far they have talked about, I think it was the trial of Socrates, where he was on trial for corrupting the youth, where he humiliated a judge, um, and yeah.
It's not just that. It's not just me. They're gonna soon be taking over positions like the judge positions in Athens. These young people, and they won't have the proper background. They won't have the proper understanding and respect for tradition. I mean, everything I've worked for, everything I want to hand over to the younger generation, is being hurt, damaged.
So this is the judge he's talking
He doesn't
about.
even have a job. Just hangs out down there, corrupting the young. I mean, that's one of the motives that older generations have, I think, for really worrying about corrupting the young is this kind of justifiable one. They really are worried about the society. They really are worried about the world. They think that they have made great contributions. They don't want their contribution to be neglected or overthrown. And I'm sure that played a role in bringing charges against Socrates. But there's another one too, and it's maybe a little more personal, more self-interested. But the older generation soon is going to have to depend upon the younger generation, right? I mean, they're going to be dependent upon them, and so there's a lot of personal fear about what kind of society is going to be around when they're getting old, when they're no longer in the positions of power. And there are probably many, many more. There are personal motivations that parents have with worries about their children. I don't want my kid. I mean, think about people being concerned about the corruption of gangster rap. Think about people being concerned about the corruption of drugs. I mean, they're concerned about what's going to happen to our society, but they're also concerned about what's going to happen to my kids. What's going to happen to my kids? I don't want my kids torn away from me. I don't want my kids turned into enemies of mine. I mean, that's what they're worried about. And of course, largely kids say, well, look, don't worry. It's not going to happen to me. But that doesn't stop the concern. So I think that's what brought these charges against Socrates. But what if there was an orator who was absolutely brilliant in his effectiveness, and whose doctrine, that is, the thing that the orator was preaching, was, in your own view, deadly evil and monumentally destructive? I mean, different ones of us will have different views about what that doctrine is. So pick your favorite doctrine, the thing that really, would damage people who came to believe it and would damage the world. I mean, let's say this is so...
I think one obvious example for me would be the manosphere, and I guess pickup culture and that kind of sect. I think that is incredibly damaging to young men because it's a very damaging worldview, because it makes you view women in a very reductive way, and it kind of ruins your chance to have any kind of meaningful relationship with women.
This orator is so strong in his powers of persuasion, and the doctrine is so dangerous that you have very good reason to believe that the world that society or something is simply going to collapse within the next generation, within your lifetime, not just the next one, if this person is allowed to go out and speak. But all the person does is...
I think all you can really do with the manosphere is like have voices that are disagreeing, but that welcome curious men who are open to change and invite them in and be welcoming towards that. I think the Dr. K and the Healthy Gamer community, they do a very good job at I guess disrupting the manosphere, because they give out a lot of very helpful content to young men that addresses their problems, but without just telling them, oh, women are the problem. Yeah.
Speak. That's all the person does. The person never tells people to do anything bad, just puts ideas in their head that will lead them to do bad things. You can Adolf Hitler is supposed to have been somebody with those kinds of skills. Now, I don't know. It's impossible for me to actually to fully believe that, but it's complicated. I do understand German, and I've listened to the speeches by Hitler, but they sound shrill to me. But I am affected by knowing what he did. I am affected by the intervening years. So maybe what sounds shrill to me would have sounded moving had I not known all these things. I don't know, but
well, of course, with Adolf Hitler, Germany was in a very bad spot after World War One. They had to pay for the damages that they caused during the First World War, and Germany was kind of in ruins. And Hitler gave everyone an easy scapegoat, the Jews, and he said, if we persecute the Jews, then we'll be able to get Germany back on track. And I mean, it kind of did work for a little bit. They were on their path to world domination. Obviously, the world united against them, and Hitler committed suicide after he was about to be captured. But yeah, I think, of course, now knowing all the context about how evil the Nazis were, it's hard to accept his speeches. But I mean, people still do. There are neo-Nazis today, so I mean, the speech still works on some people.
In any case, he is supposed to have been someone whose powers of persuasion were absolutely monumental, at least in the particular time and place where he used them. That he had a real good sensitivity to his audience, and he knew who he was speaking to, and he could make a point, and he could persuade, and did. And furthermore, he persuaded people of a doctrine that was really monumentally evil. Placing two things together. One, an idea about the nobility of the German people, and then pairing that and making that almost interchangeable with the doctrine about the evilness of others who were not to be deemed as Germans or Aryans. But what if there were such a person, and you've now plugged into this as a variable, you've plugged in your own worst, most dangerous doctrine. Would you, in your mind, continue to believe in the doctrine of free speech? There are limits already to free speech. Everyone knows that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's one of the limits. Whether that's a limit on speech or not is something that legal theorists might argue. Perhaps it's merely a limit on provocative action and not really a limit on speech. That's a detail that I don't think I want to get into today. I want to know about genuine limitations on speech. Now, in order to make that part of the case, this person, this persuader, is not telling people to go out and rob banks. He's not telling people to go out and kill themselves. He's persuading them of a doctrine which may have such things as that as their consequences. But he is not advocating any of that stuff. He's very, very cautious and very, very careful. But you, because you're designing the particular dangerous doctrine I have in mind. It might just be a variable in your head, if you like. But you are convinced that letting this guy free to speak is going to wreck society. I mean, I'm trying to set you up so you're in the position of Socrates' accusers. Let's say you really believe that this guy's going to wreck society. And all he's doing is talking to people. But he's so sleazy. He's so persuasive. He just gets in there and gets at people. So, the floor is open. This is to be a discussion, not a lecture right now. What do you think are the rights of society in this case? Yes?
I think if they're that deeply concerned about it, they have the right to stop it, but I don't think that gives them the right to kill him.
Not kill him, not execute him, as is the case in the Apology, but to stop him from speaking. And the grounds would be the great danger that is perceived to be the result. Because part of the problem here that you all see, I'm sure, is that this is a matter of perception. I mean, I've emphasized that different people will have different dangerous doctrines in mind. Different people, if you're thinking of real live people out there in the world who might be examples of this, if anyone thinks of an example of such a person, my guess is that there are different examples for different people. And your example, if you thought of a real live person who you think is kind of like that, might not seem so dangerous to somebody else. Yeah?
I think it's acceptable for his speech to be limited, but I don't think it ever would. In our society, I don't think it ever would happen that it would go that far.
So now, all right, there are two different ways of interpreting that, and I guess I think from the last thing you said, I may have misinterpreted it first. I thought you meant that practically speaking, you never could get, really stifle somebody's speech. But I think what you mean is, it's not just that, you'd never be able to or you'd never be practical, but
It'd be counterproductive. Like, I think the best example is Hitler. When he was coming to power, the German government at the time tried to quiet him down, and it didn't work because they had already let it go too far. He would become a
Yeah, it's tough because it's the Streisand effect. When you try and shut people out, it only makes their message, it widens their audience, but at the same time, deplatforming people can be very effective. Like if someone's spewing hate speech and you ban their YouTube channel, I think that would be an effective way of silencing them, because sure, they can move to other platforms and they'll bolster a fan base, but they won't be able to discuss their ideas on YouTube where it'll get picked up by the algorithm. So I don't 100% agree with the fact that you can never silence people.
martyr if he'd done anything,
Mhm.
and then that would have made the situation worse.
Mhm.
I think that's the way things would happen in today's society with a figure such as Socrates.
Okay. What if the person were more persuasive than Socrates? I mean, what if? Maybe we can tell. I mean, I'm not sure what I think. I mean, as far as what would happen in the United States. I mean, I see a great deal of intolerance on the part of my fellow citizens, although sometimes there's great moments of tolerance as well. But I mean, if it were left to a popular vote, I mean, I think there's a lot of people who are walking the streets today who, would have been executed if it were left to a popular vote at certain moments. And some of those people are, I'm guessing, guilty of sin, and some of those people might very well be innocent. I mean, the popular mood, if that were the determiner of who gets to speak and who doesn't, or who gets to live and who doesn't, I'm not sure that this would be a very safe place to live. It's because of that First Amendment that says that In the Constitution it says that we don't care how the popular votes go. You can't suppress speech. I mean, that's what it says. Where speech is tantamount to conspiracy to violate the law, where speech is tantamount to inciting to riot, then those accusations can be brought in a court of law. And I think they're not regarded as genuine limits on speech. They are crimes in their own right. Just like, I mean, I may wind up using this example over and over again. I hate to repeat myself, but I often do. But I certainly have a perfect right to move my arm like this, right? It's my arm. But not if there's a knife in it and you're standing in front of me, right? I mean, those are the circumstances in which that's not just moving my arm. And there's lots of circumstances like yelling "fire" in a crowded theater. That's not just speaking. That's not just speaking. So what the limits of protected speech are, that's a really touchy legal issue. But by and large, the bias of the Constitution is that you shouldn't limit speech, I think, even in the kind of case I'm outlining now. But we've got two votes that say, under the very hypothetical circumstances I outlined, in which you, and I speak to the individual you because, again, there'll be differences from person to person, in which you thought that the speech of this very persuasive person would bring the ruin of society, in that case, and maybe, I think you're probably thinking in the back of your minds, if this weren't an idiosyncratic view, I mean, if you were joined in this view by many, many others, maybe most of, the majority of your fellow citizens, then I've got two votes that say it would at least be okay to suppress that speech. You suggest that it might not come down to it. Any contrary views? Right there.
I think you can't really suppress his speech, but you can suppress the actions he's inciting. If he's saying, okay, let's run around with guns in our hands, then ban guns. Don't try to limit his individual rights. Well, I mean, limit
To speak.
Exactly. Because that's what our society does. I mean, it's not like people can go around preaching, drive 100 miles per hour on the highway, but we have laws saying you can only drive 65. Things like that. Don't try to suppress his speech, suppress the action or the doctrine that he's inciting and supporting.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, look, here's something that's close to home. I'm afraid that this example, will wind up, appealing to a bias in my audience, in the audience I'm speaking to. So I'm sorry about that. So try and think of this example both ways. But in contemporary music, this happens, like over and over and over again from generation to generation, it seems. But there are a lot of people who feel that certain music acts, ought to be edited, suppressed to some extent. I mean, no one really says that they don't use the word censorship because free speech is such an important value in our country. But, I have no doubt that there's huge numbers of people who would just like to say, I'm sorry, no more gangster rap. I mean, and those are largely people, I think, who haven't listened to.
I think when it comes to art, when you're trying to be artistic, I think limiting art is almost always a bad idea because you're limiting artistic representation. And I mean, the whole point of art is it's not meant to be taken literally. It's supposed to express emotions or ideas. Yeah.
And certainly people who don't sympathize with the particular arguments used by the artists to explain why it is that they write the lyrics that they do. But I think there's a lot of people who would, in their heart of hearts say,
I think like the only exceptions I would make if like you like kill someone and then you like make art about it, like, hey, I murdered someone. I think that's bad. Or if you like kill people and then directly show that in your art. I guess a lot of gangsters rap about stuff like that. I would say that's kind of crosses a line. But I mean, if you're just like talking about killing like imaginary people, then I think that's completely different. But then even then, I guess if you talk about killing imaginary people and then the person goes on to murder people, I think I wouldn't disagree with like platforms if they're like, okay, this was obviously the artist planning murder, and then they deplatform him. I would understand that. But yeah, I think in general, censorship of art is a bad thing.
that should just be against the law. And the reason is because they think that this unduly influences people to lead lives that are violent. It's not just, I think, because they find the lyrics insulting. I think they're worried about corruption of the young. They're worried that the youth of America is going to take to drugs and weapons and abandon all ambitions for any other life but the life portrayed in gangster rap music. Now, that's, when put like that, it's it's quite ludicrous, I think, to imagine that this is going to corrupt the youth of America. But maybe some people would find it plausible that at least it would corrupt a sizable portion of the youth of America. It will lead some folks astray. That's the reason for the war on drugs, or at least one prominent reason for it, is that drugs, people don't imagine that drugs are a problem of adults as much as they quickly imagine drugs are a problem of kids. Whereas I think that's not accurate. The war on drugs is a war against something that is going to destroy the youth of America. I think that's the problem for most people. They're worried about their kids. Now, that's not speech, but if someone advocates legalization, as one is perfectly free to do, and as many, many people do, many people in all kinds of different positions of political prominence, religious prominence, sheriffs sometimes do. But I think people sometimes have the same, would offer the same argument about advocating the legalization of drugs, that case shouldn't be made. That case shouldn't be allowed to be made in public because they're so fearful of the harm that drugs can cause. So there's a couple of examples, contemporary examples of one very definite, urges on the parts of lots of people to suppress speech, and that's the music case. And then maybe a little bit shakier case that I'm now making that I think many, many people might be prepared to limit speech if speech is going to be used to persuade people to legalize drugs. Now, that's a shaky case. I've never heard anybody say that. I've got much less evidence for it. It's just a suspicion of mine that lots of people would like to shut that conversation right down. It's just too dangerous. It's too persuasive. People would be convinced by this. We'll legalize drugs, and then we'll go to hell in a handbasket. But that's the kind of thing I have in mind. I'm asking you to take into consideration this kind of argument. I'm asking you to pick out something that you might think is all that dangerous. It might not be the music. It might not be the drugs. Maybe it'll be some fascist. Maybe it'll be some communist. Maybe it won't be political views at all. It'll just be a religious view that would lead people to, all become cult members of some kind. Very persuasive people out there in that line of work. Now, we, in our society, let them speak. But is that what you should do in these especially in these drastic cases. Yeah.
I don't think you can point the finger at any one person. Is granted, even though someone may be speaking out and what they're saying may lead to confusion and people might go out and hurt themselves. I think you'd have to blame the entire society because they were too ignorant in a society to teach everyone and educate them to know that what this guy's saying.
Or just because they fell for it. I mean, if we're thinking about.
If the society went out and whoever listened to this guy went out and hurt themselves, that you couldn't blame the guy, you'd have to blame yourself and the entire society.
I think you definitely can put some blame on someone if someone's speech directly causes someone to take their life, because you can't really blame society because society is kind of like a construct. It's like it doesn't really benefit anyone. I think whenever you like put your blame on like a group of people, like a very large group of people, and you can't like point to any one individual, I think that's a very bad way of thinking about things. It's like if you fail to get a date and you blame like women for it, it's like that's not a very good thing to do, because it's like, I don't know, maybe that's a bad example, but I don't know, maybe say if like I don't know, maybe it's like Trump gets in power and then you like blame America as a whole for like falling for his tactics. I think that's a bad way of looking about things, because America, like, that's way too nebulous. Like, what do you even do at that point? Yeah.
For not educating the entire society to know that what this guy's saying is going to lead to destruction of people.
Okay, so it wouldn't be right to blame just this one person. I mean, because if this person is able to be successful in the society, then there has to be a broader base in which to lay blame. But are you going to let? I mean, that's nice for you to. I mean, that'd be when you do nothing. Like, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I mean, just so you know where my cards are, I'm really an advocate of total free speech. But I mean, I'll play devil's advocate. I mean, if you do nothing on the grounds that, well, or maybe you might try some counter persuasion. I mean, I don't think you're saying you should do nothing. Maybe part of what you imply is we should be hard at work doing counter persuasion if we really think that this person is, but we might not be that good, right? And let's say we're not that good, and we don't stop him, either by our persuasive efforts or out of principle because we feel that he has the right to free speech, and let's say then society does go to hell in a handbasket. I mean, what position are we in then? He says, well, we did the right thing, even though society has gone to hell in a handbasket.
Well, if we use force against him, it would be just the same exact thing from our side. The same preaching and using persuasion to convince people to go out and hurt themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's the exact same thing on the other side of the spectrum. Because we can't use force to stop him, as he can't do that. So we need to be a society educated, in itself to counteract that before it even starts.
Okay, I'm going to call you in a second. I want to make sure I didn't ignore some hand that went up before and I missed it. Okay, I'll get to you second.
Along the same lines as him, if you consider cult leaders, the people who get involved in cults, I believe, start out knowing
I'm making the case so as to, make it seem that our efforts would be puny compared to the efforts of this super persuader. One thing to question is whether anybody really is that much of a super persuader. I mean, whether there are, whether you, for example, even with the cult members, there are people who are professional deprogrammers who, for better or for worse, rightly or wrongly, can go in and kidnap somebody who's been persuaded by one of these cult people, and they can take them out and they can de-persuade them, probably using same damn techniques. And kidnapping is it's a peculiar way of saving somebody from someone who supposedly kidnapped you. I mean, it's it's an odd situation, but I'm thinking about doctrines and persuaders that are as persuasive as those cult things seem to be among some people. One of the main, it's not the main, but one of the main advocates of freedom of speech in the United States has been a group rather maligned lately, the American Civil Liberties Union. They're really liberal. But the American Civil Liberties Union has fought for civil rights of people of all kinds, and among them the freedom of speech for years and years and years and years. And so they're a good example of someone who has just occupied the ground that speech should be protected. And it's not always easy. I'm going to give you two little vignettes, two little examples that probably could be repeated from all over the country. Just I happen to be from Chicago originally, and these are examples that I remember from my growing up years, not childhood exactly. But one of the examples comes from a town called Skokie, Illinois. And in Skokie, Illinois, sometime, I think back in the 60s, I don't know the exact dates, but sometime or another in Skokie, Illinois, the American Nazi Party decided that it wanted to have a parade there. Now, Skokie, Illinois, at that time, and I don't know what it's like anymore, I haven't been back. I mean, I was from the north side of Chicago, so I had friends in Skokie and friends all around that area. But at that time, it was predominantly Jewish. I'd say it was up in the 90% level. And what's more, and this is again back in the 60s, there was a surprisingly large number of the people who lived in Skokie, Illinois, who actually had been refugees from the death camps in Europe, World War II death camps. So we have a town with a predominantly Jewish population, and indeed a town with a population that has a lot of people with very, very bad memories, very, very sensitive on the issue of Nazis. And the American Nazi Party decided that that was where they wanted to hold their parade. And so they filed for a parade permit, as you have to do. If you want to have a parade, if you want to assemble in the park, they want to do all these things, have their speeches, wear their uniforms, carry their flags, march to the center of the town, and hold a rally. And of course, this town of Skokie said, "No way! We're not going to let you do that. I mean, you're going to seriously hurt people who live here. I mean, this is going to be very damaging to them." And the American Nazi Party said, "Well, but these are public streets. That's a public park. We have our civil rights. We may file for a permit like everybody else, and you have to give it to us. I mean, you may say that this date is filled, but I mean, you can't do that indefinitely either. I mean, you have to give this to us." They said, "Well, I'm sorry, we're going to refuse you. It's just going to be too damaging to our citizens. Why don't you hold your rally in Chicago? I mean, there's a lot more people in Chicago, and surely you'd be able to attract more people." He said, "Well, that's silly. In Chicago, we'd be small fry. I mean, there would be no reason for the press to cover us if we held our rally in Chicago. And we need the coverage in order to bring our message to the largest number of people. We need the press coverage. We need the news event. And we have a feeling that the town of Skokie is hostile to our ideas, and so we want to march in particular there. I mean, that will attract the press. We will get more coverage. It also will, in the very act, express some of the things that we believe." The town of Skokie said, "No, I'm sorry." Well, the American Nazi Party, and this must be, they're not particularly liberal, as you know, but this must have been a pleasure for them, said, "Well, we're going to go get the American Civil Liberties Union to represent us in court. The American Civil Liberties Union has support from all kinds of people, but it has a large support from the Jewish community just because it supports civil rights. It has large support from the black community just because it supports civil rights. These are issues important to those minority communities. And so, and of course, as I say, their sympathies are liberal, not at all Nazi, not at all fascist. I mean, the worst thing in the world is to the people in the American Civil Liberties Union is something like a fascist regime. But here was the American Nazi Party coming knocking on their door and asking for legal representation in this civil rights case. They said, our rights are being violated. We have a right to parade. And the American Civil Liberties Union, on principle, decided it had to take the case and had to represent them. Because, in fact, their civil liberties were being denied. So they took the case, lost huge numbers of dollars in the course of this, because lots of people couldn't understand how the American Civil Liberties Union was going to support the American Nazi Party. You know, and you can understand why people would say, I'm sorry, I can't give you any more money if you're going to use it to help support the American Nazi Party. Nonetheless, the ACLU, with huge losses of funding, went ahead with the case. And of course they won it because the Constitution is quite clear on the subject. The American Nazi Party does have the right to parade and hold their rallies in public places, and the town of Skokie does not have the right to deny them that parade permit.
I think you could make the argument, though, that with the Nazi ideology is that Jews need to be executed, and that ideology directly harms people. So I think there is a case that you can not allow them to protest, because they're not just saying words, their words are directly harming people. And yeah, I think, I don't know, I think if the town council had good lawyers, that they could have won that case if they made the argument that we're stopping people from potentially being killed because of this ideology if we allow the Nazis to grow in numbers. And yeah, that is a very common technique that Nazis use, like, oh, I'm allowed to like express myself. But if your end goal is to harm people, then that's where I think your rights end. I think there's like a saying, it's like your rights end when another person's rights start. It's like, I don't have a right as a maybe this is a bad example, but I don't have a right as a holder of a license to like run over a pedestrian, because that would be me harming someone, and someone has a right to be a pedestrian without being run over by a car. Yeah, I don't know. I don't agree with this example.
Now, this might seem to some of you like a kind of a travesty of justice. And here we have this principle that we're supposed to use to promote good things, and here it's promoting a bad thing. The second vignette, which I can give you in a couple of minutes, involves another situation outside Chicago, Illinois, and this involved the town of Cicero, which is on the south side. The town of Cicero is a lily-white suburb, if you like, but it's really, suburb is not quite the word. It's an oldish town. It's a lily-white town, at least back in the early 60s. No one, I think this was still in the 60s, no blacks lived there. And as a matter of fact, they were particularly vicious towards blacks that even entered the town. People would get beaten up if someone mistakenly, maybe a vicious owner of a property might rent to a black family. The black family would not live there long. They would have things thrown through their windows. I mean, it's anonymous. No one ever could be caught. The town of Cicero felt that they were endangered. They felt that they looked at the communities around them and they saw that there were more and more black people living in those communities. They didn't want to live in a community with black people. They wanted to maintain the integrity, as they put it, the racial integrity of their community. So they were discouraging. Discouraging isn't quite the strong enough word, but they were discouraging any businesses, residences, anything like that on the part of black people within the city limits of Cicero. Well, Martin Luther King, who you're reading in connection with the Credo, Martin Luther King got wind of this and said, I think we should have a parade and a rally in Cicero, Illinois. Break the back of this thing. So he filed for a parade permit. And the town of Cicero said, you must be nuts. No, of course we can't give you a parade permit. I mean, there are people who are very, very emotional on this subject. There are people who are very, very frightened of the prospect of blacks moving into the community. I mean, you really upset lots of people, especially our older community members. You really upset them a great deal. And Martin Luther King replied, but it's our right to walk the streets of Cicero and rally in the public park.
Yeah, I think the obvious difference there, though, is that Martin Luther King, his movement isn't aiming to harm people. He's just trying to basically advocate for his own rights, which doesn't really impact the rights of a other people. I mean, I guess you could argue that like you have a right to be discriminatory, but now there are laws that say that like you can't discriminate based on like age, or not age, but race or gender, because it's been recognized that it's bad to be discriminatory towards people of other races. And like there's no real good reason for you to discriminate based on race. I would say in the vast majority of roles, maybe. Yeah, I would rephrase it to say all roles. I think you shouldn't be discriminatory based on race, because it ultimately race is just a made up social construct. Like it's just people in certain areas tend to share the same genetics, but it's not really based on anything like scientific.
And to make the long story short, of course, the town of Cicero denied the parade permit, and Martin Luther King turned to the American Civil Liberties Union. The American Civil Liberties Union took the case, defended it in court, and of course, Martin Luther King and his parade won, because the Constitution is clear on this issue. But the upshot of the story is that, and I think you probably, I don't think this comes as news to you, but the upshot of the story about free speech is, first and foremost, those people that I think of as the most dangerous people in society aren't necessarily the people that you think of. You may think of them as the saviors of society. And that we're not going to get much agreement across the board on this. So first, we ought to, I mean, this is the argument for the free speech policy. I mean, I'm just trying to state the case on that side because I've so heavily leaned on the other side leading up to this. The case for free speech is just, if you're if the government is entitled to limit the bad guy's free speech, the government is entitled to limit my free speech, and the only way to protect mine is to protect everybody's, and that's why we protect free speech. That's reason number one. Reason number, and that I think is something that everybody sees, but reason number two you might not see. This is due to John Stuart Mill, who's a 19th century philosopher. I mean, not due to him, but he, in a book called On Liberty, enunciated it very clearly and very well. We need others who disagree with us. Maybe we need most those who disagree with us in powerful ways. We need them to speak out. We won't know the full virtues of our own beliefs unless we have something to contrast them with. We won't know whether we believe what we believe because they're right, or just because it's all we've ever heard in our life, if there aren't others around to offer conflicting views. Any society needs people. I mean, it's the people who believe A that need to hear from the people who believe not A. So it's not just a question of, well, I can't speak freely unless I allow you to. It's that I need you with your different views to speak out so I can test mine against them, so that I can maybe learn from them. I mean, that's what a free society needs, according to John Stuart Mill. So that's a second argument for free speech. We know from the Apology that Socrates is not the least bit apologetic, right, about what he does. What he does is to make inquiry, from his point of view, he makes inquiries in search of the truth, in search of answers to questions that are very important to him. From the point of view of his accusers, he's kind of badgering people. He's badgering and humiliating them. The word humility can be used in a variety of ways. If we say that humility is a virtue, that means that we shouldn't be too grand, we shouldn't be think too highly of ourselves, but humiliation is not a good thing at all. So it's not silly that different people would see this process in different ways. But Socrates is certainly not the least bit apologetic. In fact, when he gets to the point in the trial, let me see if you remember this, because it's kind of fleeting, but it's very significant. When he gets to the point of the trial where they've already decided on his guilt, right, and they're about to proceed into the sentencing, because of the way that they do this in Athens, the defendant, Socrates, gets to make the first suggestions about what he thinks the penalty ought to be. And he hems and haws and says a number of things, but what's his suggestion? What does he say they should do?
Praise for it. Isn't it like he's only good enough to die?
He's only good enough to die?
Well, I mean, anything below that wouldn't be good enough for him.
That's not what I'm thinking of. I don't remember that passage. Yeah. He should be rewarded. How? What's that passage say? I mean, there's actually a footnote that sort of helps to clarify.
He
Yeah?
wants free food, I guess.
That's more or less it. I mean, they have this particular arrangement, the way I understand it. They have this particular arrangement so that when the returning Olympic athletes, the victorious Olympic athletes are coming back from the Olympics, they get feted. They get free food. They get free board, I guess, and maybe they get put up in houses, but they're supported. And this is what he proposes that the court should do with him. So they found him guilty of a crime, and so he's asked to consider, well, what should you do about this behavior of mine? Well, I think it should be rewarded. I think you should give me free food. That's likely to have been regarded as fairly arrogant by the court, and that response by itself, if Socrates really did respond in that way, that response all by itself might account for the fact that their sentence was not particularly lenient. They sentenced him to death, of course. But he thinks he is doing good. He thinks that if they get rid of him, they'll need to find somebody to replace him. He thinks he's doing a fine thing. It's worthy of reward. He doesn't believe he's coming up with any answers, but he does believe he's helping people to understand that they don't know in those cases, in those cases where they really don't know the things that they think they know, and that's a useful lesson, because people think they know the truth on an issue, but really don't. They'll be misguided in the things that they do. Yeah.
I think he says that they not only need to find someone, but they're not going to find someone that he's it. I think he says that over.
Aha. So he says that they won't find anybody either. That he's the only one that is likely to be able to do this so well. I think in part because of his love of Athens, because of his devotion to the city of Athens. Well, all that said, it's pretty obvious that he must then think that the actual sentence that they come up with, namely that he should be put to death by poison, he must think that that's unjust. He must think that's wrong. And when we get to the Credo, there's nothing at all in the Credo that would give us any reason to think he's changed his mind about this. Right? Nevertheless, what is it that's the main thing going on in the Credo?
Credo's trying to get him to escape, but he won't.
Okay. Credo offers Socrates a chance to escape. Credo suggests that he and his friends would support such an attempt so that there'd be money available. There's a certain degree of power among those people who are interested in Socrates' escape. So he's pretty confident that they can pull it off. And he offers this opportunity to Socrates, and Socrates' response is, somebody else? Yeah.
No.
He says, no. Now, my question for you, and this is the way I want to bring this to the floor, is, well, how come? I mean, he surely hasn't changed his mind about the rightness of his behavior in Athens. That hasn't changed. And so surely he agrees with Credo that the sentence is unjust. Nevertheless, he's not going to escape. He thinks it would be wrong. Why? Yes, sir.
Because he wasn't acquitted. If you were acquitted,
Loud enough so that I can hear you.
because he kept saying he wasn't acquitted. But just whether he was right or wrong isn't the point. It's the fact that the law found him guilty, and therefore he can't. It would be unjust for him to go against the law.
So it's because the law says that he's supposed to stay there and get executed. But isn't the law making a mistake in this case? You're absolutely right. Socrates thinks that he should obey the law because it's what the law says to do. The question is, does that make sense to you? Yes?
Didn't he say something about if he were to leave, then it would in some way dramatically affect the government there, like other people would?
Well, he runs through a lot of considerations, and one of them is something like, well, I would, here I've been standing for something, and I think we have to establish what he's been standing for. I've been standing for something all these years, and if I were to go now, it would be like betraying that. And he thinks somehow or another that if he were to go along with Credo's plan, he would be acting in such a way as to destroy Athenian law, to destroy even the very idea of law. Yeah.
I think he didn't want to destroy his own integrity. He built up with the people. He was talking about integrity and wanting to.
That's absolutely important. He doesn't want to destroy his own integrity. He doesn't want to betray everything he's always stood for. But look, why would this act destroy his integrity? If in fact the judgment is unjust, why would escaping an unjust sentence, why would that destroy Socrates' integrity? That's question one. Question two, what on earth could possibly give him any reason to think that his escape with Credo, if he did that, would be destructive of law or of Athenian law? Why would he think a thing like that? Now, those are two questions we've worked up to those two questions, and I want to address them. But before I just enunciated those questions, you had your hand up, so I want to get to what you wanted to say.
Well, I was just thinking that instead of for his own cause, he might decide to martyr himself instead of just going running away.
In other words, that maybe his death would do some good. His death would produce good for a cause that he cared about. That's what you mean by martyring himself for the cause. That's conceivable, but I mean, I'm dubious. I mean, I'm not sure, and that's possible. You know, you never know what's in a person's mind, and that could be what's in his mind. And also, you have to once again remember that Plato is writing this sometime later, and Plato has to, you know, sort of portray not just what Socrates' words were, but he has to portray all kinds of features of the situation by putting them into this dialogue between Socrates and Plato. So maybe he's trying to say something, because he's writing later after all, maybe he knows something about what Socrates' death meant to him and to some others, and he's trying to put that information in the dialogue. All that's possible. I'd say this, I don't think Socrates was in a position to know that his death would be meaningful to lots of people. He's certainly not in a position to know that his death would wind up being discussed 2,300 years later in a classroom. I mean, you know, he certainly didn't know the full significance that his death and his life would wind up having. And I don't know whether he thought that there was a cause that would be helped by his death. He seems not to mind death very much. I mean, he's 70 at this time. I'm not sure whether that comes out clearly in the dialogue. He's about 70 years old. And he's lived a long life. And he's going to have to die sometime. This isn't a bad way to do it. He's being fed and stuff right up to the last moment. Doesn't have to go through a long, prolonged illness. And he has some optimism that maybe there might be a life after death. He doesn't know one way or another. But his position on that's called agnosticism, when you just take the position, well, I don't know one way or another. He's an agnostic with respect to life after death. And so that means that, well, you know, maybe there's a real possibility that there'll be another life. And then he can go badger all these people who've been dead, so all these historical figures that he's always wanted to question. He can go back and bother them, ask them all these questions. So he doesn't think death is necessarily painful or a bad thing. So I mean, I think that's the stuff he says anyway. That's the stuff that Plato has him say. I'm more prepared to make those kinds of things his motives. But there might have been a thought about martyrdom. Here.
Isn't there something in the very front of it says where he had a dream about Socrates may arrive at fertile Deia on the third day, and on the footnote it says that would be.
Where are you in the text, just so I know what we're doing?
On the second page, page 58.
58. And where on the page?
At the very top is the quote.
Oh, okay. But that's right. He had a dream about that, and then that initiates the discussion, I think, where he, you know, ends up saying someplace later on, all of this just goes to show that we don't know that death is a bad thing. We don't know that it's not a good thing, and so we shouldn't assume that it's a bad thing. I mean, that's the upshot of the discussion. You're absolutely right. The conversation begins with this discussion, you know, this dream. Yes, and then back to you.
You touched up on a little bit. You believe in the everlasting soul, and when you kind of discussed it a little, it also said that you know, you had to take care of the soul, take care of your body, and obey the law, and all that ended up being, you know, what he was some of what he was talking about.
Indeed, and life isn't the important thing so much as the good life. And if one has to make choices between this and that, I mean, one chooses, even though it may be very hard, one should always make the choice in behalf of goodness.
And I guess he felt running away would be going back on his own teachings.
Well, see, this is what I'm trying to get at. Why? Why? Here.
Yeah, that's basically what I was going to say.
What teachings of his? He doesn't teach anything. He doesn't know anything. He just asks questions. What does he stand for? He doesn't stand for any doctrines, as far as we know. But anyway, you had your hand up?
Yeah, first off, he'd be going against because he told him that he should get all this food, and if he had wanted to be exiled, says he could have said, he wished for exile.
Well,
It would have been at least like more noble if he wanted to do it.
somewhere in there, in the Apology, I believe it is, not so much in the Credo, but maybe in the Credo too, there's a clear indication that he doesn't have any interest at all in exile. I mean, you know, he doesn't ask this at his trial. He doesn't say, please just find me innocent and I'll shut up. Why? Because he can't shut up. I mean, shutting up is death. I mean, his life is asking these questions. His life is hanging out down in the public market and having these conversations. So he can't shut up. Well, how about exile then? I'll go do this someplace else, like down the road in Sparta, or over in Syracuse. I'll go someplace far away. Not Syracuse, New York, but Syracuse, which was in Italy. But he can't do that. Why? His concern is for Athens. I mean, that's part of the, we haven't emphasized this, but his concern is for bringing the right kind of humility to his fellow Athenians. This is a public service on his part, as far as he's concerned. He thinks his city is in trouble if it's being run by people, the citizens or the important public officials, who think they know the answers to questions that they really don't know the answers to. I mean, he thinks that's very dangerous. I mean, the comparable claim, and it makes a great deal of sense to me, but the comparable claim in the contemporary world is, we are not well served by public officials who think they know the answers to complicated questions that they really don't know the answers to. It would be much better if they just simply said, I'm not sure, than if they thought they knew, believed they knew, invested huge amounts of energy and huge amounts of capital on the solutions that they thought were the right ones. If they're the wrong solutions, we're wasting a lot of effort and a lot of cash, and we may be damaged by these policies which really don't solve anything. I mean, you might be talking, you might think about international policy. Someone thinks, I know how to keep international peace. Well, what if they really don't? Then it's troublesome if they really think they know the answer. If they become crusaders for the wrong answer. Or I know how to solve the nation's economic problems. I mean, if somebody has a half-cocked idea about how to solve the nation's economic problems, and they get into the position of power where they can actually implement their ideas, and if these are the wrong ideas, then we could be very seriously damaged. I mean, so the claim would be, let's admit we don't know the answers to these complicated questions. Now, of course, Socrates is usually talking about philosophical questions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a major problem right now, is a lot of countries are going through economic hardships due to a coming recession, and a lot of the people are turning towards right-wing leaders because they claim that they're able to help the economy. In Trump's case, it was because he hammered on about immigrants, and how they're like stealing jobs. He's like, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. You just hammered on about that, and then the economy has not done any better under Trump's leadership. I mean, the stock market is doing very well, but in every other aspect, like unemployment is up, inflation is up in the US. So yeah, and the economy in the US right now is just propped up by the AI market, mostly by Nvidia selling GPUs to AI companies. But yeah.
What is justice? But this preaching of the idea of humility is something that has application everywhere. Now, it's got to strike everybody as a good idea, in principle, to say if people don't know the answers, well, they should say so. Especially if political candidates don't know the answers to difficult questions, they should say so. But I mean, that's in principle, you could see that seems like a good idea, but it can't happen. It can't happen in a political debate, where one candidate says, "Here's the way to solve the problem," and the other candidate says, "Well, that won't work, but I don't know what will." I mean, that's just not going to get votes. So I mean, we've got to, that's one of the problems that democracy has to live with. But I think there could be no doubt, but that we would be better off if people who didn't know the answers would just tell us that. Yeah.
Okay. I think like he goes over like two wrongs don't make a right, and then he says that.
Why? Before you go on, let's go on. The two wrongs don't make a right. But just to emphasize, this question penetrates a little bit deeper than that. Why would it be wrong for him to escape if the sentence is unjust?
He says that like if he did escape, it would mean that their laws weren't like enforceable, which would hurt the country.
Okay, I think all right. That's the kind of thing that I believe is closer to his motivation. He really does think he'd be doing something that would be destructive. He really does think that he would be doing something that violates everything he's ever stood for. And I'm trying to figure out how can that be. Now, what has he stood for? Well, not for apparently any particular doctrines, but he has stood for this search for the truth. He has always tried to examine every doctrine that's come before him and figure out whether it's correct or not. So there's a certain kind of consistency there. He's interested in reason, if you like. He's interested in this quest for the truth, to pursue that sort of thing is to pursue a certain kind of order. Now, I'm going to make an analogy that he didn't make, but might work for understanding what he's up to with respect to the law. Think about the relationship between reason and unreason. I know Plato, anyway, his later doctrines make it easy for me to talk about this. Plato, in later work, made it clear that he thought that reason should rule equally in the individual and in society. And he may have picked up some of this stuff from Socrates, but in any case, he's the one who's writing this, and this may be the beginning of this later doctrine. As reason is supposed to, reason isn't supposed to shut up the appetite so that the appetite never gets its way, and reason isn't supposed to completely silence the passions so that the passions never get their way. For Plato, in his later work, reason is supposed to be what disciplines and guides these things. For Plato, the human soul, or the mind, or the psyche, however you want to describe it, really is a spiritual thing, and it's an annoyance that it has to deal with all these appetites and passions. That's an annoyance. The real life of the soul, according to Plato, should be more ethereal than this. For Plato, as for later Christians, there's I think a Baptist hymn that goes, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." Well, this is a doctrine that Plato would have embraced very gladly, because the human being is dragged down by physical existence for Plato. Reason is the real life of the soul. Unreason, the opposite of this, is chaos for him. It's unhappiness for him. It's damage to the human soul. Now, the parallel in society, I think, is law. Just as reason is what has to guide the human soul, in society, I think law plays that same role. And for him to say that because I believe this sentence is unjust, I am at liberty to break the law, he thinks would be a kind of an incoherence, a kind of something like a self-contradiction almost. We couldn't formulate a law that said that. I mean, we can't. I mean, you don't have laws if they go like this. You may not ever steal from anybody unless, of course, you think it's okay to do. I mean, the law can't be written like that. That's not a law. That's like a suggestion. It's not a law. And so to act as if you have the right to disobey the law when you think that what the law is demanding of you is unjust, to act in that way would be to act in a way that is destructive of law. I mean, I think that's the whole point of saying that if I were to escape with you, I would be acting in a way that would be destroying the law. And then it's in that context that he goes on to say, and I certainly don't want to destroy the law. I think not just because of its importance, but now because the law of Athens has been so good to him. He says things like, I've always, I've been entitled all my life to leave if I didn't like it, but I've stayed. I've had opportunities to work for changing the law if I didn't like it, but I've stayed, and I haven't changed the law. So now it would be wrong for me, it would be a betrayal of the law if I chose to disobey what it told me to do. But the main thing in this, he's actually talking as if his interlocutor is the law. Yes?
Can you explain, okay, you said reason has something to do with the soul.
See, all right, I may not have given enough there. I mean, the soul, or the psyche, or the mind is all of that stuff that you're most immediately aware of. It's not supposed to be anything mysterious. It's supposed to, if you think about it, it's what you are most aware of. It's yourself. And the self, according to Plato, has three parts. And this actually is picked up again by Freud in the 20th century in some ways, some small way. But the three parts for Plato were reason, which is what we might think of as the mind, passion, which is things like courage, and appetite, which are hunger for food, water, sex, all of those things. Now, the passions and the appetites, I suggested to you, are things that are products of our mere physical existence. And for Plato, like for Christians later on, anyway, I mean, not just Christians, but just I'm trying to make a parallel that might be familiar to some, the soul is something that kind of resides inside the body and has a life independent of the body before birth and after death. And so the passions and the appetites, which are the things that the body generates in a human life, those are attached to this physical stuff. And they're kind of fleeting. We live for a short time in this suit, as it were, this physical suit. The real human life is the life of reason. That's the genuinely human life, because that's the life that the spiritual part of a human being contributes. So reason is the most important. Reason is in the driver's seat. Reason should control, not silence, because we do live in a body. The appetites and the passions do have something to say about our life, but it's reason that will sort of make selections about when it is appropriate, when it is right to go along with the passions and the appetites. So for Plato was a very kind of his idea of the right kind of human life is a life in which the mind is in control. Okay? And when you conceive of reason in that way, and when you conceive of the human being in that way, the analogy between reason on the one hand and the law in society is a little bit clearer, I think. The law, it plays the same role in society as reason is to play in the individual human being. Does that answer the question? allowed them, again.
The Keith Noyes decision is that during his defense, he said that he didn't resent death, but if he tried to escape, that would mean he did.
So in his defense, he said he didn't fear or resent death.
And if his penalty was death,
But if he,
that was-
right, well, that's right, but he might like life. I mean, you don't necessarily escape death just because you fear it. It might be instead because you really have some things to do. that death would really get in the way of doing those things. So, I mean, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, but, you know, I don't think he's in a position if he escapes to have to say that, oh, well, I guess I'm conceding that I really did fear death. I mean, escape itself might be dangerous, I don't know, which is one risks one's life. Yes?
Exactly what did they convict him of? Because the charges were kind of really
Vague?
yeah.
They convicted him apparently of exactly those vague charges.
Because didn't he pretty much prove every single one of those to be wrong? And it seemed like they only convicted him on the human nature side.
I don't think anything gets proved in that apology. I mean, I don't have any evidence of what's proved and what's not. I just have a long, some would say long-winded defense on Socrates' part, in which he doesn't, you know, he makes some, I think, halfway telling points, like, if I'm corrupting the young, I mean, this is one of the most telling points in there is, if I'm corrupting the young, how come neither any of those young or any of the corrupted ones or any of their families, how come none of the families of the kids that I've been working with are among my accusers? Now, you know, if he really were doing something bad to anybody, you would expect it would be their family who would be right there first and foremost among the accusers, and he indicates that that's not true. But I don't see that, I mean, I don't really think anything is proven or disproven, and the charges are vague enough so that it's a matter of judgment. It's like trying to decide whether anything is really basically corrupting or not. Right now, the Supreme Court is taking up a case on the internet and whether internet should be allowed to be used for the passing around and displaying of certain kinds of materials that are deemed by some people to be pornographic. The main concern is because, well, kids might get a hold of these web pages.
I think when you're banning like the internet as a whole, that's very dangerous because the internet is basically a utility. And I think that would be very similar to, say, cutting off water to someone's house. Because they're like doing something that you don't like, even if that action is probably reprehensible. I don't think turning off their water is the right action. Same with the internet. I mean, and I mean, most people would agree there's nothing inherently wrong with porn. Well, I don't know, maybe porn can definitely be problematic, but I wouldn't agree with banning it from the internet. Yeah. I think you have to, what you have to do is, like, if something is reprehensible, like, say if, I don't know, say if there's like a site that like teaches you how to like make bombs, instead of just saying you can't use the internet to tell people how to make bombs, which then basically invokes a great form of censorship where people are, where ISP providers are then given the right to look through your data and censor you based on what you say, which I think can go very wrong very quickly. Instead, you say on google.com, we're gonna not post, we're gonna list websites that tell you how to make bombs. And say on YouTube, we're not going to recommend videos to you that teach you how to make bombs. It's still censorship, but it's not as bad, because if you really want to, you can still access that stuff. So it's not completely like blacklisted from the internet, but it's still hidden from the vast majority of people. So I think that's a better way of going about censorship.
And kids can and do. But the question of the Supreme Court is: does restricting the right of people to put stuff like that on the web, is that something that can rightly be limited at all, or is this a free speech issue? They're going to have to make a judgment. I mean, how is anybody going to come in? I mean, when the charge is this stuff is dangerous, this stuff will corrupt kids. What's the evidence for and against? I mean, one person's corrupted kid is another, depends on what some things that are fairly unequivocal, but one person's corrupted kid may be some other person's idea of a liberated kid. And then if you're trying to make a decision about what the overall upshot of having stuff like that available is going to be within the society, that's a judgment call. It's not going to be real easy to see how one could prove either side of that question about what the overall upshot is going to be. And that's the kind of question that was placed before the Athenian court. So I think I think you're absolutely right. He was convicted of a charge that is extremely vague, certainly subject to interpretation. That is probably, that it was that vague is a shortcoming of the Athenian system of justice. But in a way, those charges come up all the time, in every generation, in every nation. Those questions arise about which things should we permit and which things should we not permit. And in the end, it's got to be vague. I mean, if somebody pretends that it's precise, it's a sham. The question is not precise. The question is vague and has to do with the overall well-being of society, and that's why it's vague. That's a difficult thing to grasp. Let me move past this particular issue, because the thing I wanted to get to, we got to. Socrates believes that apparently, from what we see in the Credo, that we should obey law because it's law. We should obey law even when we take it to be unjust.
I definitely disagree with that, because laws are not a benchmark for society. And sometimes when a society is unjust, there could be morally reprehensible laws, like, for example, in Nazi Germany, when the law was all Jews have to go to concentration camps. Then it's like, if you're like hiding a Jew in your house, you're like directly breaking the law. But to follow the law would be I think the vast majority of people would agree would be the morally reprehensible option.
And the reason for that is that to take on to oneself the idea that I am going to disobey the law because in my view the law is unjust, that is destructive of the very idea of law, and to destroy law is to throw society into chaos. And that's the general line of thought that we see in the Credo. Now, you've had a chance to look at the Martin Luther King essay. And while there's lots and lots of things in there, for example, in one place, see if I can find it, he actually mentioned Socrates, and it seems to me that he gets Socrates wrong, but I'm not quite sure what he has in mind. This is on the bottom of 237. Is that right? No, that's not Socrates. Yes, it is. It's at the top of 238. A single one-liner, left column, very top. He says, to a certain degree, to a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. Now, I don't think he did. I don't think that Socrates is the right authority to cite there. Socrates did things that annoyed people. I guess, maybe lots of people, before they brought Socrates to trial, maybe lots of people said, Socrates, shut up. And he kept on talking. But when it came down to it, the evidence from the Credo, maybe if all you knew about was the Apology, you could draw inferences that, well, maybe Socrates had been disobeying the law. But if you read the Credo, Socrates' position on the law, at least as portrayed by Plato, is pretty clear. You should obey the damn law. And that's just where I think we have a very intriguing contrast between what Socrates says about it and what King says about it. Now, King's reverence for the law seems to me to be at least as great, reverence for the idea of law, to be at least as great as Socrates'. He's not someone who thinks that law is a small matter and that people shouldn't be concerned with it. That's just not his view, at least as portrayed here. And everything I know about Martin Luther King suggests that he cared very, very much about the law. He wouldn't have worked so hard to change it if he didn't care so much about the law. But he takes a position that's couldn't be more different from Socrates'. He does not believe that we should obey laws just because they're laws. What does he say? What is the right position to take as regards obedience or not to the law? Yes?
That unjust law is no law at all.
Okay, that what?
An unjust law is no law at all.
Well, that's a part of the position. Do you actually find a passage that says that there? Because that's a traditional position called the natural law position about law. And I want to get to that in a second. But more simply, we must make a distinction between just laws and unjust laws. I think he conceded that that's a difficult distinction to make, but we have to make a distinction between laws that are just and laws that are unjust. And it's the just laws that we must obey, not the unjust ones. And indeed, it can be wrong, morally wrong sometimes, to obey unjust laws. We may have a moral obligation to disobey when the law is unjust. Now, let me review this particular, perhaps confusing remark, which is, again, I want to identify as the sort of traditional statement of what's called a natural law position in legal philosophy. The remark is that an unjust law isn't really a law at all. That might seem confusing, because didn't we just say it was a law? It was an unjust law? Oh, I mean, that's like saying a red wagon isn't a wagon. And that's at least puzzling. But what the natural law position says is that there is an underlying ideal of justice. It's that underlying ideal that law is supposed to emulate as nearly as it can. In the Declaration of Independence, there are very clear statements of natural law, of the natural law inclinations of Thomas Jefferson, shared by many of the people we call the founding dads, the founding fathers. But we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The whole intimation that there are certain basic inalienable rights, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that governments, I'm not quoting precisely now, governments are, their job is to protect these rights. In other words, the rights precede the governments. The rights have a basis that are deeper than what any government's laws say. That's the essence of the natural law position. That what's right, what's wrong, what's just, and what's unjust isn't just the product of a legislator or a judge's decree. The jobs of legislatures are to make laws that correspond to the underlying deeper principles of justice. And again, you see that if government, in the Declaration of Independence, if governments don't do this, if they don't do their job, if they're not protecting these natural rights, these inalienable natural rights, if governments stop protecting them, or worse, if they start violating them, then the people have a right to overthrow those governments. The governments aren't legitimate. People have a right to overthrow them and set up a new one that will do the job. Now, that's the natural rights position. The idea is that what's right, what's wrong, what's just, what's unjust is something that you have. Those are standards that are independent of what the law says, and laws may be compared to those standards. And when laws don't, when they don't, when they're inconsistent, let's put it that way, when they are inconsistent with the standards of justice, then they are not legitimate, because the whole job of law is to embody in a practical way the principles of justice. So the laws are illegitimate if they don't, if they are inconsistent with justice, and that makes them not really laws at all. That's what's meant. Laws that are unjust aren't really laws at all. Now, you don't have to go so far as to want to put it that way. Again, I think it's a confusing way to put things. And you don't need to put it that way. But what you can say is that justice is a standard that is always, in principle, independent of law. So we can look at some nations, some other nations' laws, and even our own laws, and we can talk about some of them as being right, some of them as being wrong, some of them as just, some of them as being unjust. And I think King's position is probably stated most fairly in this way. If there are laws that are so unjust, not just some small injustice, but when there are laws that are so unjust that they do great, great damage, they do great, great evil, then it's not only okay to disobey those laws, it may be morally obligatory. So that's the King position. Very, very different. And why would we want to disobey the unjust laws? Well, it's just because law is so important. We want to purge law of all of its any injustices that might be there. We need people to respect law. I think I'm now elaborating on King's point, but I think he might have said that it's vital that people respect law. If they're told something like what Socrates says, if they're told, look, obey the law whether it's just or unjust, just obey the law because it's the law. If people are told that, that's going to breed disrespect of the law. It's going to make people lose their respect for the law. They'll begin to treat the law as something that's to be obeyed only because if they don't, someone's going to come and get them, punish them. That's the only reason to obey law. We've got to make sure that, according to King, that law continues to be associated in people's minds with justice, and that's why we must not say that law is to be obeyed only for its own sake. We must say law is to be obeyed because by and large it represents justice. And where it becomes clear that there is great injustice being done by some law, we must weed it out. And weeding it out may require civil disobedience. Okay, now there were a few hands that I just sort of rode over because I wanted to make the statement of the case. I think yours was one, yes.
Who or what determines whether the law is just or unjust?
Impossible question to answer. It's like, who's to say? And I think King isn't one to take that question lightly. He was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He was, as far as I know, a very devout Christian. It wouldn't surprise me if his answer was prayer might help. But I'm an atheist, so prayer doesn't exactly ring loudly in my ear. It doesn't tell me quite what to do. Nonetheless, I think when religious people pray, they do something that's very valuable. Now, this is just from the point of view of someone who does not believe that there are any gods. So I'm just speaking for myself right now. But I think that what prayer does, in lots of cases, when it's done in a very serious way, is it opens people to the possibility that maybe they have been acting wrongly, and maybe they've been mistaken. When a believer puts herself or himself in the presence of God in their mind, when they're thinking that they are in the presence of God, when they're praying to God, what that means to them is that they are in the presence of somebody who can't be fooled, somebody who knows them like, through and through. And so there's a tendency, I believe, for people to kind of stop fooling themselves, to open themselves to the possibility that maybe they've been mistaken. And that's all to the good. I mean, anything that we can do when we're trying to really think of what's the answer to a complicated question, what's the solution, what's the path that we should take. When we're really trying to do that is very useful if there's anything that we can do to sort of really seriously consider that maybe we've been mistaken. That opens the door to the possibility that we're wrong. So I think that's the kind of, whether you call it prayer or not, I think I have to ask myself, if I'm just trying to decide whether I'm to disobey this law or not, what are my real reasons for being inclined to disobey it? Is it really because the law is unjust, or is it rather, for example, that the law is merely inconvenient to me? What are the consequences of this law? Are they really so bad as to warrant something as serious as disobedience to the law? Whether you regard the people who run the government, who made the laws positively, that doesn't matter either. If what the law says is something that is reasonable to do, you should do it. Whether it's not necessarily because it's the law, it's because it's reasonable to do it. If the law is maybe just a bit silly, it might still be the best thing, all things considered, to do what the law says anyway. There's lots of arbitrary things that the law says that there's damn good reasons to do. I mean, it doesn't, it says that we should drive on the right side of the road. Now, there's nothing in principle righter about right than left, but that's just it's correct to do that because that's the law. That's what everybody does. That's what everybody expects. And to do something different would endanger people. So those are the reasons to obey the law. But where great injustice appears to be done, if you open yourself to the possibility that maybe you're making a mistake, and if it still says, "Oh, I'm sorry, it's unjust, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong," I think those are the times when King might say, well, that's when disobedience is called for. I don't wish to answer the question. I mean, unfortunately, when you're presenting two different sides to a story, one's got to come second. I mean, I think this is just one of those philosophical problems where it's very, very difficult to tell what exactly one ought to do. What's the answer to the question? But the question is, should one always obey the law? Socrates appears to answer yes. King appears to answer no, not always. Not when the laws are sufficiently unjust. And I think I have to leave it there. It's one of those questions that doesn't have any particularly clear-cut answers, and I hope that both sides got presented equally well. All right, the Meno. We begin that next time.
All right. I'm gonna go get a drink, and I'll be back shortly. I'll just. Alright, I'm back. Let's start the next video. Introduction to Philosophy, Lecture 3, Ethics. Epistemology and Logic, Plato, Part 2. Skip this.
Okay, any questions that you have or comments, remarks about the Meno, especially, because that's the topic of this week. A more difficult reading, and you'll find Aristotle more difficult still for next week. It'll be shorter. And then Anselm goes crazy, and then we'll come back from that abyss, and it'll be a little bit easier after that. Any questions about the Meno? What's going on in the Meno?
You're reflecting on ethics and what it means.
Ethics, that's partially right. And I understand exactly why that's the first thing that you would be inclined to say. But what is it? The word ethics isn't what they use. What do they talk about?
Like what word would describe different meanings, or what would be described in ethics?
Well, all right. Well, what's the word that's used in the dialogue? Do you remember? Virtue. Okay. Now, I understand exactly why you are paraphrasing in the way that you are, but it's risky. The first thing I want to do is to explain to you what the Greeks meant by virtue. I don't have to have a diagram here, but let's just put this up for my use. Back. Most of us, in the normal English usage of the term, think of virtue as being specifically an ethical term, right? So, I mean, it makes sense in our modern English usage to think that we're talking about just ethics. But that's not the case for the Greeks. It's not the case for the Greeks. It's not just matters of ethics that are being that are at stake here. Yeah.
Isn't it like any quality of human being,
Not necessarily of human beings either. The suggestion is it any quality of human beings? You mean any quality, or did you mean to narrow it down at least a little bit further? Like virtues as applying to human beings would be what kinds of features?
not physical, but the way you act and stuff like that.
Okay, well, we're guessing. I mean, I'm going to have to, this is not something that I can expect you to know. I mean, this is not something that's in the book, and it's not something that's common knowledge. But would you ever, in the English language, now this is just a litmus here, does it make any sense to you at all to talk about a virtuous computer or a virtuous monitor? Does that make any sense to you at all in English? Well, given the way that the Greeks used the term, that makes sense to the Greeks. Now, we use value terms some of our value terms in much the same way that they did. For example, I can talk about a good computer. That's a value term. And I can talk about a good monitor, and a good whiteboard, and a good pen. I mean, these are ones that work properly. That's a value term. And there's good and bad pens, things that do or don't suit their purposes, do the things that they're supposed to do. That's the way they use the term virtuous, or virtue. A virtue is any property at all that contributes, looking for that word, to excellence in things of a particular kind. That's kind of a qualification, things of a given kind. I mean, the virtues of a pen are not going to be the same things as the virtues of a TV. These are good-making properties. Good. Good brief summary of what I've got in mind here. Any property at all of a given kind of thing that contributes to excellence in things of that kind, that's a virtue. So when you list the virtues of chairs, I mean, one of the most important ones would be that they support human weight. Then there'll be different kinds of chairs, like there's some debate about whether in classrooms you should have chairs that are more or less comfortable. If you have chairs that are too comfortable, it's sometimes believed, people will fall asleep more easily. You should have chairs that sort of not only support weight, but don't contribute to drowsiness. Those are the virtues of a classroom chair. But the virtues of an easy chair, of a reclino lounger, they would be different. The virtues of a bar stool would be different still. It's still a kind of chair, I guess. So that different particular subclasses of things will have differing virtues. But I think you've got the general idea. So when the Greeks talk about virtue, they're not just talking about ethical issues. There aren't any real ethical issues to be raised about the virtues of a sewing machine. Now, when they're specifically talking about people, they may not be talking about what we would think of as ethical issues either. What are the properties that make for excellence in a human being or in a human life? Well, some of them are going to be things like maybe honesty, benevolence, kindness. Those are good-making properties. Those are things that make people better people. But what you have to include here is anything at all that makes a human life better than it would be if it lacked that property. So, yes?
So you're saying they're not just talking about ethics?
They're not just talking about ethics.
But they could be talking about ethics.
That's one of the things that they could be talking about, because ethical properties are among the properties that make for excellence in human beings. But here are some examples of some other ones. Cleverness, knowledge. Those are not particularly ethical, but they're better properties to have than not to have. Wealth, power. The Greeks, like all of us, can argue about which are the things that make for a good human life and which things don't. But it's at least in the ballpark of the inquiry to suggest, as Aristotle did, and as some Greeks would, that a certain degree of wealth is necessary for a good human life. Why? Well, consider this, for example. One of the properties that it's important to have is kindness and benevolence. Now, that's an ethical one. But in order for your kindness and benevolence to do any good, you ought to have some resources with which to be kind and benevolent. You do more good than you otherwise would if you got some resources to use. Power, well, we often think of power as corrupting, and Aristotle and other Greeks would have thought that too. They would have think of power as having the potential of corrupting, but powerlessness is no good. To be completely impotent, without resources, and without the ability to accomplish your goals is not a particularly good thing in a human life. It's better to have some power tempered by wisdom and benevolence. So that's the way this all works. So it's just as you say, the things that are virtues in a human being includes the normal list of ethical virtues, but there's other virtues too. It's not just ethics. And I'm glad that you brought it up right away, because that's the first and most important thing to know about what they're talking about. And what are the questions that they're asking in there? They're talking about virtue, But what are the questions about virtue that are raised there? Yeah.
Is it taught?
Can virtue be taught? And just cutting to the chase, what's the answer to that question that's given? Answer isn't yes. Virtue can't be taught. Instead, what?
But is knowledge a virtue?
Knowledge isn't exactly, I mean, knowledge is among the things that one could attribute or call human virtues, like I said a moment ago. But knowledge isn't virtue. I mean, they're not equivalent. I mean, not, you know, to know things, let's put it that way. To know some things is better than not to know things. To be wise is better than not to be wise. In the back.
It's a gift possessed from the gods.
It's a gift from the gods. Now, you can take that in a couple of different ways. One way.
I think virtues can be taught, but they can also be intrinsic. Like, for example, you can be taught to be kind to people if your parents are like always very kind when they're interacting with other people. Then you're gonna learn, you're gonna pick up on that as a child and learn to behave that way. Whereas if your parents are mean to people, you're more likely to be mean to other people, of course. You can go against your upbringing. So it's not like you're guaranteed to be virtuous if you're taught to be. But I think virtues can be taught. I mean, that's literally the whole point of like raising someone, is that you teach them how to behave. Like, there's a reason that children need parents. It's because they need to be taught how to behave in the world. So yeah, I don't agree with that.
It would be, well, some people have it and some people don't. The gods determine who gets it and who doesn't. That's kind of an elitist interpretation, and that might be correct. That might be what Plato has in mind. But there's another interpretation that seems to me to actually, I mean, he may have meant both of these things. There's no reason why they're not in conflict. But the other interpretation is a little bit more fruitful in the general discussion. I think he means at least also to say that virtue isn't the sort of thing that other people can give you. I mean, that's what he means to emphasize, that your having it is not dependent on somebody else's giving it to you. Now, that's one of two main themes, and the one I want to spend more time on is the one about knowledge. Okay? Theme 1, virtue. Theme 2 is knowledge. But before leaving the virtue area, let me, it's not the right one. Before leaving the discussion of virtue, I want to remind you about one of those pre-Socratics that I mentioned the other day. The group called the Sophists, headed by Protagoras. There's some reason to think that competition from this other group of philosophers is what motivates a lot of Plato's own work. What do they believe? Do you remember what Protagoras is noted for believing? Man is the measure of all things. They were relativists, thoroughgoing relativists, not just about ethics, but about our views of the world. And what's more, the Sophists had a reputation as itinerant teachers. They would go from city to city, offering their skills. This is before there were anything like universities. Plato, in fact, partly, I believe, to counteract the influence of the sophists, established the first university, if you like, in Athens himself, called the Academy. But before that time, they didn't have set institutions. Teachers would go from town to town and sell their services to the wealthy families. And if there were really a general doctrine that these sophists taught, it seems to have been something like what Protagoras taught. They would proclaim their ability to prepare the young men. It wasn't the women who would get an education, it was just the young men, who to prepare the young men for their lives in whatever particular society they lived in. So if the teacher, one of these sophists was visiting Athens, then their sales pitch would be this. They'd say, look, we can, you send your kid to me, and we'll teach this kid everything he needs to know to be successful in Athens, if that's what you have in mind for him. If, on the other hand, he's going to be your sales representative in Sparta or something like that, or if he's going to be a statesman, we'll have to teach him some of the things that you have to know in Sparta. But the main thing is, we'll teach him what's right and what's wrong in Athens, because after all, answers to these questions differ from place to place, but we'll teach your kid what it is that's regarded as right and wrong in Athens, and what's regarded as being successful or not successful in Athens. And then if they would wander down to Sparta, they would sell their product, teaching, with a comparable line, this time all about Sparta. They would say, we're not going to bother your kid about what you need to know in Athens if your kid isn't going to live in Athens. We'll teach you the principles of right and wrong as they are understood in Sparta. And we'll teach you the worldview that is most widely believed in Sparta. And if the parent says, well, I'd like my kid to know what's the fact of the matter. I mean, I want him to know what really is right and wrong, and I want him to know the way the world really is. Never mind what the Spartans believe, never mind what the Athenians believe, and that's where the sophists, or at least Protagoras, would proclaim, well, there is no such thing as the facts of the matter. All there are these different views that vary from culture to culture. There's no such thing as objective truth in these areas. We'll teach your kid what your kid needs to know. Won't bother him with questions that have no answers, like questions about the objective truth. So we'll make a success of your kid. Now, this is not very far different from the, at least part of the marketing strategy of modern universities. Modern universities also advertise to their prospective clients and the parents of their prospective clients that the main reason why you should send your kid to school X, like RIT say, is because we'll help them learn.
What does RIT stand for? Rochester Institute of Technology. Okay. It's a private research university. It's only 1%, so it's not a particularly prestigious university. Okay.
What they need to know to lead a good life. And we'll teach them what they need to know, not only about their careers, but about other stuff, so that they're prepared to go out there and lead a good life. There's not the same emphasis on relativism, but again, it's not, sometimes it does seem, I think, in the modern educational world, that the most important thing is, how do I succeed? That's the most important question. That's what I want to get out of college. I mean, a lot of people have that attitude. I want to know, what do I need to succeed? And while it might be very interesting to pursue deeper questions about what's the truth and what's the meaning of life and things like that, nonetheless, I don't really have a lot of time for those questions right now. I need to get my career training under my belt. And that's not just RIT that markets itself that way. That's just about every school on the planet these days. But that's the way, a more radical version of that is the way that the sophists marketed themselves. And so they taught that they could teach virtue, meaning those things, those excellences that the young student would need in order to succeed in life. And it's against that doctrine, I think, that Plato is directing his attention here in the Meno. He says, no, virtue can't be taught. It can't be given to you by somebody else. You either got it or you don't. And the place to look is inside for virtue, for excellence. It's not something you can get from someplace else. I guess the same lesson might be taught about the modern self-help book industry. I mean, the self-help book industry is based on the idea that you should buy these books and they'll help improve you. And I think Socrates' message would be, well, it's not really likely that you're going to get, you're not going to get excellence from these books. It's inside you. The very best that these books could do is to serve as a catalyst. I mean, they might inspire you to look inside at the right thing. They might direct your attention in the right way so you can find your excellences, but you're going to find it inside you. No one else can give it to you. And I think that's what he means by saying, that's at least one of the most important things he means by saying that virtue can't be taught. It's the gift of the gods. So much, at least for the moment, for virtue. What I want to spend most of our time talking about today and Wednesday is this somewhat more interesting to me, anyway, doctrines that Plato has about knowledge. They're interesting in part because there's some of them kind of weird. I hope you noticed that there was the stuff about virtue in the beginning and stuff about virtue at the end, but then a lot of other stuff in the middle that didn't seem to relate to virtue very much. And I think that's one of the things that confuses readers of the Meno for the first time. Also, there's a kind of sense in which you're left hanging at the end about virtue. It can't be taught, it's not clear what it is, and they just kind of wander off. That's the way a lot of Plato's dialogues end. They raise a question, they talk about it for a while, and by the time they get finished, they haven't settled the issue. Now that, at least, that part of these dialogues may be true to the real live Socrates. Because Socrates, after all, said he didn't have any doctrines, he didn't know anything, he just served to sort of be a critic of other people's views. He thought that was extraordinarily useful service, but that would mean that his conversations wouldn't end up with answers to the original questions. Indeed, people would maybe go into these conversations thinking that they had answers to the questions like what is virtue, what is justice, what is piety. People may think they had answers to the questions. The function of the dialogue and the function of Socrates' analysis, as often as not, is to just show people that those particular answers won't work. And you don't get an answer to the question at the end. In fact, you're sort of robbed of your sense that you knew what you were talking about in the first place. What is knowledge in this dialogue? There's a contrast, for example. I'm going to take another page so I can blow up this knowledge thing a little bit bigger. There's a contrast between knowledge and, how does he put this? I have so many different synonyms. True opinion or true belief. He distinguishes between these two. Now, you should know that when we're talking about knowledge, we're in an area of philosophy called epistemology. And here we're discussing Plato's epistemology. Ology, that's suffix. What does that usually mean? You know? Whenever you see it? Study of, okay? So this is the study of epistem. It's the study of knowledge, okay? And the first question in epistemology, the deepest question is there anything that we really know? And to give a negative answer to that, to say, well, no, there's nothing we really know. All we have is beliefs and opinions. To say that there's nothing that we can really know is to take a position called skepticism. The skeptic says, the epistemological skeptic says, there is no real knowledge. But if you think there is some knowledge, then there's a whole bunch of further questions to ask, like, well, what characterizes knowledge? How can we distinguish knowledge from mere belief, mere opinion? How do we get knowledge? Are there reliable ways of acquiring knowledge? There's a whole sub-area of epistemology, at least I think of it this way, called philosophy of science. Science seems to many people, to be most people, I think, to be an extraordinarily successful way of gaining knowledge. So you want to study knowledge, or study science. What is it about science that makes it so successful? Is there such a thing as a scientific method? If not, then what is it that characterizes this huge array of disciplines that we call sciences? How do we tell sciences from non-sciences? Maybe there's some of them that, some people would claim that some disciplines that use the word science in their name are just trying to get the prestige that the real sciences have, and the real sciences are limited to things like physics and chemistry, biology. So the people who think that are inclined to dismiss the claims of the social sciences to scientific status. But then there's all kinds of good arguments that suggest that the hard sciences themselves are but doctrines held by a certain part of society, so that they may best be investigated by the social sciences themselves. Lots of controversy here, but the whole question is it true or is it not that the sciences have something especially good going for them when they're in the quest of knowledge? And if so, if they do have something especially good going for them, what is it? Because if you could figure that out, then maybe you'd be able to take that thing that sciences do so well and bring it over to some other area of inquiry and use it there and get the same kind of success. That's part of the motives. All right, but epistemology is generally the theory of knowledge. And what we're trying to do here is to figure out what's the distinguishing character of knowledge? What makes it different from true opinion? Now I'm going to ask you that question. I want you to think about it given what you've read. What is it that Plato says distinguishes knowledge from true opinion? Remembering that it's true opinion that we're talking about here, true belief. It can't be, the answer is not going to be that knowledge is truer than true opinion. Nothing is truer than true opinion. True opinion is true. If I have a true belief, it's a true belief. It's true. So that's not the thing that distinguishes between knowledge and true opinion. There are also false opinions I have, but we're not talking about those right now. So among the beliefs that you have that are true, what's the distinguishing characteristic? According to Plato, or if you don't like that question, according to you, if you think there's a difference, what distinguishes between these two? I knew the Mino was tougher than the other ones. There's far fewer hands this time. Yeah?
Maybe the difference would be even, like, some people might not think a true opinion is true, whether or not it's true.
Okay, so some people might not think that the true opinion is true, whether or not it's true. Isn't that also true of knowledge? I mean, if you're thinking about a particular proposition, like, well, we've used as an example before the Pythagorean theorem, so I'll put that up here in its algebraic form. Some people might not think that's true. Other people might think it's true, but not be sure. And yet other people, well, might know it to be true. And that's what we're trying to find out what distinguishes all these things. Let's get another candidate. Yeah.
An opinion is formed by yourself, whereas knowledge is either acquired from someone else or learned through experimentation.
Okay, so the suggestion is that opinion is something you acquire by yourself, whereas knowledge is something that's either learned from someone else or acquired through experimentation. Don't you acquire beliefs, sometimes even false ones, let alone true ones? Don't you sometimes acquire false beliefs from other people? And can't you also acquire false beliefs from experiments? So what's the distinguishing feature of knowledge? You had your hand up.
Is it that opinion can be taught, while knowledge is something you just have?
Opinions can be taught, but knowledge is something you just have. There's some truth in that as far as Plato is concerned, although I don't think that at this stage of the discussion that makes a great deal of sense. We're trying to work up to there. Plato really does think that knowledge, like virtue in a way, is something that you just either have or don't have. That's not its key feature, though.
A true opinion or true belief can never be discredited, whereas knowledge can be refuted.
Knowledge can be refuted. It's precisely the opposite. Okay. The suggestion was true opinion can't be discredited,
Right.
while knowledge can. I like the idea, though. Consider this. I mean, see if this is, I'm following your. If I have, some beliefs that I have may not be susceptible to any kind of tests at all. They're just beliefs I have. I'm going to hold on to them come hell or high water. It doesn't matter what happens. And so, there's nothing that two people who have different beliefs, there's nothing they can do about it. They just, maybe they can persuade one another, but there's just no evidence that could ever bring them. I don't know. I don't think opinion is necessarily the word to describe that, but it's an interesting distinction. Whereas, and you're suggesting knowledge is something that is refutable. It's something that, at least in principle, there could be some evidence that would, you could bring it to the court of evidence. I guess that's the very interesting proposition, but it's not Plato's distinction. Certainly not Plato's distinction. And I don't think, if you think about that for a while, there's lots of things that you can bring to the court of experiment that you wouldn't want to call knowledge. Plato says it's this. How am I going to put this so it's just right? I'm going to have to spell it out a little bit to make this just the way I want it. If I truly know something, then I must be able to prove it. And by prove it, I'll put more underlines. Plato doesn't mean just give some good reason for. He means prove beyond all doubt. To be able to truly know something, there can be not one shadow of a doubt for Plato.
Wouldn't you also be able to prove an opinion? You can prove that you have an opinion.
That you have the opinion?
Right.
Probably not. We'll see in a moment what standards we're applying here. But, proving that you have an opinion in any case is different than proving that opinion. Here's an example right off the top of my head. As far as Plato's concerned, now I'm sure that the Pythagorean theorem is true. I'm absolutely positive of that. That doesn't yet entitle me to say I know it. Why? Well, because I can't prove that right now. I cannot right now give you the proof. I'd have to be able right now, before you, to prove, to line by line, show you the proof of the Pythagorean theorem, one way or the other, either in its geometric form or in its algebraic form. That's the way you're looking at it here. I'd have to be able to prove it. What does that mean? I'd have to be able to start from, this is the real proof, indubitable premises. Start from things that can't be false. Things like, come back to that. Here's another word. Tautologies. Things, sentences really, or proposition, that must be true.
Bro, the YouTube artifact, he's really done a
For
number on
logical
his projections.
Such as all red wagons are red. Or perhaps more interestingly, another kind of example. All bachelors are unmarried. That's true by definition. So ideally, in a real proof, you want to start off. You want to be able to start off from things that have to be true, things like tautologies, logical truths. Take combinations of them, perhaps, and from those derive, through perfectly rigorous logic, any theorems or conclusions. And those theorems and conclusions, if you've done all of that, those theorems and conclusions, you can say you know. Now, I can't do that. Going back here. I can't do that with the Pythagorean theorem. So I don't know it. I believe it. Now, it can be proven. Let's just say it can. Right? On the presumption that it can be proven using those extremely rigorous standards that I just outlined a second ago, then it's something that can be known. And if once upon a time I did know it. I did know it once upon a time, because once upon a time I could prove it from at least what seemed like. Let's just put some of the stuff aside, but what seemed like logically necessary assumptions. But I can't do that anymore, so I don't know it anymore. Now, why isn't it knowledge anymore? Well, it's because it's lost its reliability. If I can't now prove it, I'm relying either on memory, or I'm relying on something somebody else told me, or I'm relying on a book. And all of these things, obviously, can be mistaken. I might be relying upon popular consensus. Everybody believes that c squared equals a squared plus b squared by now, so I believe it for just because everybody else does. But if I can't right now prove it, then I'm relying on a source that's not perfectly reliable. To say I know something, I have to be able to prove it. Now, is it clear what he's getting at? He wants to distinguish knowledge from true opinion. I do have, since this is provable, since it can be proved, my opinion that it's true is correct. It's a true opinion. It's not knowledge. Yeah.
What about when they brought up opinion is acquired from the soul, and like they questioning the servant about the square and the length of it, and that they were saying that maybe he wasn't taught that,
Mm-hmm.
and it was acquired from the soul from another time, or.
Mm-hmm. We're going to get to that's a very tricky and intriguing part of the dialogue. It's the most intriguing part of the dialogue. What did you think? You may not have been sure, but what did you think was the upshot of that little part of the dialogue? What was the conclusion that we're to draw from that part? from that little discussion with the slave boy?
They're trying to get to figure out what he knew, what knowledge of ability to square.
He seems to come to know something.
But it's not like that he knows.
Socrates claims he's not really teaching. I mean, he's not giving the knowledge to the slave boy. Instead, there's some sense in which the slave boy already knew it. Given this definition of the word knowledge, such that if I truly know something, then I must be able to prove it, as we will see, Socrates is arguing that anything I really know, I've known all along. I just didn't remember it. That anything that can be, that I am in a position of truly knowing, isn't something that can be given to me. It's something that I've known all along, in particular since prior to birth. That's the peculiar doctrine that I keep hinting at and pointing at. That's one of the most peculiar doctrines in there. But we'll get to that. Yeah.
Well, the question was what Socrates' view on knowledge and truth and
Yeah, the question is, what is the distinguishing feature? I've given that. What were you going to say, though?
Because in the book he said during the time that he exists and is not a human being, he will have true opinions, which when stirred by questioning become knowledge.
Okay, could you summarize that? Because I didn't hear. It was going so fast and it started quiet. So if you...
Okay. It said in the book, he said during the time that the slave exists and is not a human being, he will have true opinions.
Okay, I'm confused about how he's existing and is not a human being. Can you tell me the page that we're on?
Page 17.
And where are you on the page? Those little letters and numbers on the sides, by the way, are in fact references to page numbers. They're references to page numbers in a sort of a standard edition of Plato's works. But you can say 86C, and for example, and that gets you right to not only this edition, but to any other book that includes these references, and so you can compare different texts. But where are you?
The one above B.
Okay. Okay, no. They're talking to prior to his birth, right? There is he has not acquired these beliefs in his present life. It must be clear that he had them and learned them at some other time, and that was the time when he was not a human being. So that's prior. So there's an existence that the slave boy, and presumably we all have, prior to our physical birth as a soul. Now that's another powerful thesis, peculiar thesis. Based on this theory of knowledge, Plato thinks he has an argument to suggest that the soul existed before this life. And that same argument won't work about an afterlife. He offers another argument later on for that, not in the Meno. But this argument offers not religious, but epistemological reasons. That is, reasons based on the nature of knowledge for saying that the soul has to exist before this life. And it's those two theses. One, that anything that we can know can't be learned in this life. It has to have somehow been there all along. And therefore, there must be an earlier life. Those are the two theses I want to investigate. Here's a model proof. Yeah?
Is that really knowledge, though? Because is the slave really going to know what he's talking about if they go back to him the next day?
Oh, that's what exactly he thinks. Yeah, he thinks that that's exactly what he has elicited in the slave, but not because he's given him anything, but he's shown the slave that he knows something that the slave didn't realize he knew before. Socrates says of himself and says of all real elicitations of knowledge in people that what we call the teacher is not someone who, I mean, when the teacher is successful, it's not because the teacher gives anything to the student. It's because the teacher successfully elicits knowledge from the student. Plato thinks of himself as acting as a midwife. Socrates does. Socrates thinks of himself as acting as a midwife to the birth of knowledge. He's not responsible for the knowledge's being there. He just helps it come out. But yes, indeed, what he thinks is that particular little episode with the slave boy is something that will stick. And that's, by the way, the advantage of knowledge over true opinion. The advantage of knowledge over true opinion, one important one, is that it sticks. We'll get back to that later. But I think what the words that are used in the text, Plato has Socrates say that knowledge runs away in true opinion. It runs away. It escapes. If all we have is true opinion, it escapes. I'll give you an example of this. Let's say I gave you this problem. I said, let's say I told you, all right, I want you all to take careful notes because this is going to be on your test on Friday, this problem. And I'm going to show you the solution. So I want you to take careful notes because this problem will appear on your test just like that, and you're going to have to know the answer. And I'm going to give you the answer right now. 5, 12, 10, 7, 5, 6. So there it is. There's the answer. Write it down because it's going to be on your test. Come on, write it down. It's going to be your normal reaction is quite reasonable. Namely, I don't need to write that down. Give me the damn problem. And when I see it, I'll do it then. Right? I don't need to write the answer down. Unlike many other things. Now, what's the? I mean, consider the poor fellow who doesn't understand arithmetic, doesn't know arithmetic, and they're sitting there carefully taking notes. And then imagine that poor person's plight come Friday when the test rolls around. They got it maybe written on their wrist or under their watch band or something, or maybe they're just reciting as they walk to class. See, 3,486,954,082 plus 908,700,943 equals 4. Maybe all he has to do is recite this. Okay, 4,475,657,025. 4 billion. Just over and over, memorizing the thing. Then finally, when gets to the test, sits down, looks at the thing, thumbs through the test to find that problem, and gets it down as fast as he can before he forgets. And he goes, phew, and he gets it right. That's a good example of true opinion. I mean, he has the opinion that this is the answer to this question, and that opinion is true. It's correct. This is the answer. He doesn't get the problem wrong. He gets that question right. But he doesn't really know it. That's the point. For Plato, he doesn't have any kind of understanding at all why this has to be true. So another way of putting this definition, I, put semicolon, I must know why it has to be true. Now that has as a consequence that the only things that are knowable are things that have to be true. That restricts it pretty narrowly. We can't know things like the capital of New York. That's not something that can be known because it's not provable in this rigorous sense. You'll remember the conflict that I described back in the first week of the quarter between the sophists, and Protagoras as the most famous of the sophists, their relativistic doctrines that said that man is the measure of all things, conflicted with a doctrine central to the teachings of the Pythagoreans. The Pythagoreans seemed to think that there was some areas in which man was not the measure of all things, namely in mathematics, in geometry in particular. That there were true answers to mathematical questions. Here was an area where you could know something. And what was the characteristic feature of that area? It was an area wherein things could be proven. What we see from the Meno, we've gotten far enough to see this, is that Plato takes the side of the Pythagoreans in that debate. And Plato, in defining knowledge in terms of provability, is suggesting that, that what we really should do is focus our attention. If we want knowledge, we should focus our attention on the things that can be proven. I mentioned also, I believe, last time that Plato was the founder of the first university, at least in Europe. It was called the Academy. And over the doors of the Academy, there was a slogan that had this effect. I'm not sure the exact wording, but it's something like, if you don't know geometry, don't bother to come in. The reason being that geometry was the model, and it wasn't yet axiomatized. Euclid is not yet on the scene. All we have are results like those of the Pythagoreans, proofs of particular theorems like the Pythagorean theorem. We have that at the time that Plato founds the Academy, we have lots and lots of different proofs of theorems based on arguments that seem to go back to obvious presumptions, obvious premises. That's what we should be looking for in every area of inquiry. Where you can't get that kind of provability, well, then you're not going to be able to get knowledge. His attitude is kind of like the attitude of many non-philosophy students in the modern world, namely, well, all these philosophical issues where there's lots of different opinions. I mean, those are all very nice, and I guess they're kind of interesting, but I don't really have a lot of time for that. I want to explore an area where I can get some good, solid basis for the things that I'm being taught. I mean, give me facts. It's an attitude that's a pretty widespread modern attitude. Maybe later in my life I'll have time to sort of think over some of these more controversial areas like politics and ethics. Those are all very interesting, but what I need right now are facts. Give me good, hard facts. And Plato's attitude, founder of modern philosophy and science in a way that he was, his attitude was along those same lines. I mean, the things that are to be discussed here in my university are things that are provable. The world of opinion, we leave outside the walls. Discussion of things that are mere opinions, we leave outside the walls. Yeah?
So Plato agreed with Socrates that you don't learn, but you only recollect because your soul...
I would say that it's fairest to say that this is Plato's doctrine. Remember, Socrates claims not to have any doctrines, not to have any theories. And while I don't know whether he stuck to that all of his life, I think we're beginning to see in the Meno, we're seeing some of the stuff that Plato is putting forward and having Socrates be his voice in the dialogue. So this is a Plato's doctrine. There's no, and I think any time you're asking a question about this, Plato agree with Socrates about this, very dodgy questions. We don't have any independent record of much that Socrates thought independently of Plato. So it's hard to make a comparison like that. Okay, so I want to show you some things about proofs that will help us understand the odd doctrine about knowledge that Plato has. Our objective today is to figure out, that our main objective is to figure out why Plato thinks that anything you know, you must have known all your life. You have to have gotten somehow before birth. Here's a simple logical proof, if you like. It starts off, I mean, every proof has to start off somewhere with what they call premises or assumptions. Axioms, when you come to fancy theories like geometry, then the assumptions or premises from which everything else gets derived, they're called axioms. If you take the whole set, in the case of Euclidean geometry, there were 5 axioms from which all the rest of the theorems of geometry could be derived, if you include a few definitions here and there and rules of inference. But here's a simple proof that meets the kinds of standards that Plato has for all knowledge. Back up. Those are the assumptions we begin with. And I think you could all, in unison even, tell me what may be proven from these 2 assumptions. What can I draw the line. It's usually, this convention is that's kind of a therefore line. The assumptions are above the line, and so what can I prove here? Yeah. And you could plug in anything you like in the A spots, as long as you plug the same thing in both A spots. You can plug in anything you like in the B spots, as long as it's the same thing, as long as you're consistent. And the same with the C. You can just pick anything you want, and it will come out that if, and this is what's true about logic, if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Has to be true. And it's one of the things I want to explore at first is what's the sense of has to be? I mean, nothing's necessary, you might think. Nothing has to be true. Well, again, if the premises of a logical argument are true, the conclusion has to be. And just to show you the sort of thing that I have in mind, this is a valid argument form. Let's just make some substitutions. Let's, for example, say proposition 1, all, give me a word that starts with A, a noun. I didn't hear it. Apples. Give me any word that hits, that starts with B right off the top of your head. Blue. Okay. And then all, I'll have to put blue things so that I can make these all substantives, all nouns. All blue things are what? C. Quick.
Cars.
Cars. Good. Therefore, that's 2. This is 3. Therefore, all apples are cars. Now, it's hard to have intuitions about this sort of stuff, but I'm going to claim to you that if 1 and 2 were true, even though they're not, but if they were true, then 3 has to be true. Has to be true. Come back to that in a second. Well, let's see. I may need this. Let's put this side by side. Because what I want to show you is another way of displaying logical arguments. It's called Venn diagrams. And we're going to make a Venn diagram of this argument. First, a couple of, come back up a little bit. Oh, that's about as far as it goes. Venn diagrams make use of circles. Who's familiar with them? A few people, okay. So that we represent sets of things, categories of things, kinds of things. All of those are just different ways of saying the same thing with circles. So there's a circle, call it A, that represents, I'm going to say, all the apples that there are, all the apples that ever have been or ever will be. This is the set of all apples. Anything inside the set is an apple. Anything outside the set is a non-apple. So this is outside here, the whole rest of the world, not just the paper, but these are non-A, non-apples. So penguins are out here. All apples are in there. If I wanted to talk about a particular apple, I'm not going to make use of this too much. Might use a little X inside the set of apples to indicate a particular apple, or a little X outside the circle to indicate a particular non-apple, like a mailbox. Okay. But I won't worry about that right now. If I wanted to say that, now we're going to get to 1 and 2 in a second, but let's say I wanted to say that no apples are blue things, I would construct 2 circles. I would construct an A circle and a B circle. How would I draw, anybody, how would I draw no apples are blue things? Yes? 2 separate circles. A, B. No apples are blue things. How about some apples are blue things? Somebody else. How would I represent that?
They overlap a little bit.
Overlap a little bit, exactly. And the ones that I'm thinking about, if I say some apples are blue things, those things are the ones in there in the little overlappy area. Okay? Those are the apples that are also blue. Now those just were two exercises. How will I represent number 1? All apples are blue things. Some third person who hasn't spoken yet. Just sort of pass this around. All apples are blue things. Yes?
Just a circle of both A and B.
It's a little more complicated than that. Yeah?
The big B circle, the little A circle.
Okay, right. The A circle must appear inside the B circle in order to not say more than what you want. It might be that all blue things are also apples, in which case then the circles would coincide. But all you want to say is all apples are blue things. So here's proposition number 1. And this indicates, because this is all we've said, this indicates that all apples are blue things and seems to indicate also that there are some blue things that aren't apples, like shirts. There's some blue shirts. Okay. This says all apples are blue things. How well am I going to do number 2? Yet some other person. Yeah.
Make a blue circle C into
Where does the C circle go? Okay, all blue things are cars, or all B is C. It's like that. Correct. Does everyone see that this is right? Does anyone have any questions about this? So what I've done is I've in the same drawing, this one, I have indicated both the information that's in 1 and the information that's in 2, correct? Any questions? Here, yes?
Yeah. Can the A actually be in there? Because in the second one it doesn't mention A, does it?
I can't hear you.
In that.
Well, the second one doesn't mention A, but the first one does, and I'm trying to combine the information in the two propositions. And if I know that all apples are blue things, and if I also know that all blue things are cars, this is what I know. Right? If I include both of those pieces of information. That's what I'm trying to do. In the combination of 1 and 2, what I want you to notice now is that 3 is already up there. The conclusion is already there. That's the sense in which if both 1 and 2 were both true, 3 has to be true. One way of saying that is it's because the information in 3 is already contained in the combination of 1 and 2. Now this is a simple and perhaps overly obvious argument to use as an example, but I wanted to use it because I think it's clear. When you get combinations of 5 propositions, like you have in geometry, from which you're trying to derive conclusions, you can get some pretty novel conclusions, pretty surprising things. There's nothing surprising about all A is C being derived from these two, but when you get more complicated propositions and when there are more of them, you can get some pretty surprising results. Like you can get that the square on the hypotenuse of any right triangle is always equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides, and you can get another big surprise: the internal angles of any any triangle at all, the 3 interior angles of any triangle at all, always will equal 180 degrees when you add them up. That's a surprise, but you can prove that. You can demonstrate it. And what you're doing when you prove something in this strong sense of proof, this mathematical, logical sense of proof, what you're really doing is you're just unpacking information that you already have. You may not see it. It may not be transparent. It may not be obvious. But all you're doing is unpacking information that's already in your presumptions. Correct? Now that's key to understanding Plato's epistemological argument in the Meno. First, there's his definition of knowledge. You don't really know anything unless you can prove it. With a big P, prove. He means proof. Like in math, pure math. Like in logic, pure logic. Not just provide reasons for. Unless you can logically demonstrate something, you don't really know it, because that means that there always would be some room for it to be false. And if there's some room for something to be false, then according to Plato, you don't really know it. So that's the first thing. To know something, you have to be able to prove it. And the second thing is, to prove, when we prove things, all we're really doing is unpacking information from things that we already knew. Now, I've offered you this as a representative of a valid argument form. There's lots of valid argument forms. To talk about that more, you'd have to take a course in logic. But you can see from this example, especially when we used these substitution values, that validity, being valid, is not all we want out of our arguments. Because this doesn't prove to us that all apples are cars. Indeed, we know that all apples aren't cars. In fact, no apple is a car. Maybe there's something like the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile. Maybe some Apple-mobile is driving out there. So maybe some Apple-like things are cars. But this is wacko. We haven't proven anything. All we've got is validity. So the other thing you need in your argument, actually, the name for the arguments we want is, we want sound arguments. I'll put that in quotes. And they are, one, valid. That's the first condition for an argument if it's going to be a sound argument. But two, the assumptions are true. So what you really want out of an argument is for it to be sound. That is, not just valid, but also you want a valid argument whose assumptions, premises are true, and then you can have confidence in the conclusion, the truth of the conclusion. If the premises of a valid argument are true, the conclusion also has to be true. Yes?
How do you know your assumptions are true?
Aha! Well, you got to prove them. I mean, to know that. Now, again, we're talking about, now this is just generally the case in logic. And this isn't just an epistemological issue. This is what we really want out of an argument is both validity and the truth in the premises. Plato's got even stronger requirement for knowledge. To know something, for Plato, one, argument must be valid. Two, assumptions must be, what? Not just true, because we might have true opinions in our assumptions, right? It might be that we have true opinions in our assumptions, things that we don't really know, things that we were told by somebody else, things that we read in a book, things that we're just lucky about. We just happen to guess the right thing. So there might be lots of true premises from which we could derive true conclusions. The argument would be valid, but the conclusion wouldn't be knowledge, would it? I mean, because we derived it from measly true opinion. How can we know something if the basis for that knowledge is unreliable? So what am I going to... In order for something to be knowledge, according to Plato, it's not good enough that the assumptions be merely true. That's good enough for the argument to be sound. What do they have to be? Huh? Proven. What's another word for that for Plato? Known. That is, I must be able to prove them. So if I'm to know anything, I must be able to prove it on the basis of assumptions that I already know. In other words, that I can prove. So this is a kind of an iterative process. Put just write it again here. In order to know this, in order to know 3, I have to know 1 and 2, but that means that each of 1 and 2 have to be things which themselves appear somewhere as the last line in a proof that I can construct. To put that in another way, I must be able to unpack 3, if I'm to know it, from things I already know. And to know them, I have to be able to unpack them from things I already know. And those things have to be unpackable from things I already know, etc., etc., etc.
Damn, this guy's been teaching at RIT since
no place can,
1976.
for Plato, no place can empirical evidence, the evidence of the senses, it never gets to, this is all proof. This is all abstract, logical proof. And there's, in the end, this just goes back and back and back in time to before birth. There's no time when something someone tells me or something I read in a book or something that I see or hear, there's no time for Plato when any of that can enter into this proof chain. It's got to be all proof. None of those other sources of information are good enough. That's why he says that if I know anything at all, it's got to be something that's been with me the whole time. And he says it must be something that I've brought with me into this life from a previous life. And what is it that the teacher does? The teacher doesn't give knowledge to anybody. All the teacher does is to show that, given things you already know, you can get this new information out of it. And that's what he claims is going on. That's what Plato claims is going on in that discussion between Socrates and the slave boy. All that Socrates is doing is calling the slave boy's attention to some of the implications of things he already knows. In other words, kind of like shining a light, saying, maybe you didn't notice, but if you put this bit of information that you know together with that bit of information that you know, you can pull out this conclusion. It's a maybe you didn't notice this. You've already got it inside of you. Now, what is it? What is it that unequivocally, I'm going to sort of embellish on Plato here a little bit, just to try and give you some reason to think that this isn't an altogether dumb thing to say. What is it exactly that isn't given to you when you're learning something like a mathematical proof? You could be given all the steps in the proof, and you can memorize those steps. That's often what we do at first. We sort of go over a proof, for example, like if it's a Pythagorean theorem, we go through all the steps, we try and get so that we could do it ourselves. If it's complicated enough, we might still not see it. I want to put emphasis on that. We still don't get it. We still don't see it. And we can memorize the thing. We can get an A on a test in which we're asked, what's the proof of the Pythagorean theorem? We can do perfectly well on such a test, but we might not yet see it. But then at some point, you don't have to take mathematical proofs as the only kinds of examples. At some point, though, you might be working through it and you say, whoa, of course, I see it. I get it now. Now I see why that has to be true. And all of a sudden, there's that flash, that aha experience. Now, that's something, at least, that comes from you. It's when you finally see them in the proper light. You finally see how different things fit together that you didn't quite see before, maybe. Call this something like logical insight. That's something, maybe, that's inborn, that can be called upon, but which no one can really give you. Now, again, there might be philosophical arguments about that, but I think that's the kind of thing that Plato's got his claws on. I think he sees that there's something there that, or at least he thinks there's something there that can't come from experience, must be there the whole time. And his take on all of this is that is that it must mean that, that we learned this or got this somehow in a previous life. And so it's an epistemological argument, interestingly, an epistemological argument for the preexistence of the soul. Not a religious argument, but an argument based on a theory of knowledge. And Plato's theory of knowledge leads him to the conclusion that we must have existed before this life because it's the only place, it's the only way to explain the fact that we have this logical insight that could be called upon. Now, before I saw some hands, but there's one more thing I wanted to mention. I think there's just one more thing. Yep. And that's this. I wanted to offer you a modern theory that has some resemblance to this. Does the name Noam Chomsky ring a bell? It might not. It depends on what disciplines. Does anyone know in what field Noam Chomsky works? He's in linguistics. He's a extremely well-known linguistic theorist. I believe he's not. I don't know how recent it was, but I believe he's now retired from MIT. But he was the head of a linguistics program that was one of the most important in the world for years and years, and it was important in large part because of him and his work. He believes, or believed, I haven't read anything he's written recently on the subject, but he's famous for thinking that all language has a common deep structure. As different as the natural languages are, he says all human languages share a common deep structure, so that this deep structure is part of the human animal as the human animal begins language learning. And then what we plug into this deep structure depends on where we are and who we're learning language from. But there's a common deep structure. And for the moment, I'd like you to not worry about the words deep structure so much, but think of it as something like a basic logic. So that there's a basic logic inherent in being a human being. Chomsky says of himself, or used to say of himself, that he, like Plato, I don't know that he used Plato as his example, but he too believed that there was some knowledge that was innate, that is, inborn. It was knowledge of this deep structure of language. And of course, that's pretty damn important when you think of how important language is for the rest of our development, for all the rest of the ideas and beliefs and anything that we might call knowledge that we might have. Language plays a rather central role in all of that. So he thought that this capacity we have for language has a deep structure which we have to know in order to learn natural languages. And of course, again, it didn't lead him to the conclusion that we had a prior life. I mean, his conclusion, suitably more modern, is just that this is part of our hard wiring. This is part of neurophysiology. This is part of the way we're built. Our brain is designed in a certain way, and implicit in that design is this knowledge of the deep structure or the basic logic of language. So you might say that that's the kind of thesis that Plato, 2,300 years ago or 2,400 years ago, whatever it is, that Plato was trying to advance. And of course his conclusion, though, is that all knowledge is inborn, and that's evidence of the preexistence of the soul. Back there. Loud enough so that you can hear it in front.
So, Plato, is what Plato's saying only related to, like, what can be learned? Is it related to experiences as well?
Experience is not a source of knowledge for Plato. And remember, knowledge, he thinks of knowledge as something written in capital letters with exclamation points after it and underlines under it. I mean, knowledge is something very rare. Knowledge is something that can be proven. We can't know things like the capital of New York State. That's not the sort of thing that can be known. We can't know things like whether there's a hand in front of my face right now or not. Those aren't things that can be known. Why? Because non-provable. They can't be proven in particular from assumptions that themselves are known. I mean, I have to rely on vision in order to draw the conclusion that there's a hand in front of my face, and vision is notoriously unreliable. It's something we have to use. He doesn't say forget about the evidence of the senses. He says we've got to use this evidence in our daily lives. I mean, we're just forced to, but we shouldn't rely on it as a way of deriving knowledge. That is there's a sense in which that's an important part of what modern science teaches us as well. I mean, I'm just going to use this, we'll return to this later when we talk about Descartes, but what we think we see may not be true. We think we see, I'll use this example later too, we think we see the sun moving across the sky during the day, but science tells us that's not exactly what's happening. It's an illusion. What's really happening, from at least some scientific perspectives, is that the Earth is rotating about its axis and the sun is revealed at sunrise. It's not moving at all. Complications in that story too, but I mean, I just want to use it right now as an example of some place where, like Plato, modern science suggests that we shouldn't rely overly on the senses, that the truth of the matter may show us that the senses are fooling us. Modern science doesn't say that we should never rely on senses. Modern science says that there's an important role for experimentation and observation to play, but at least it shares this one insight with Plato and some of the other pre-Socratics, that what we think is true on the basis of the senses and basis of authorities is not a reliable basis all by itself for scientific conclusions or for legitimate conclusions.
All right. That was the third lecture that we have watched. I enjoyed that. Next stream, we'll be watching lecture number 4, Introduction to Philosophy, Metaphysics, and the Philosophy of Science. All right. I'm gonna end stream now.